just to get right into some stats. So the one thing I like to share is just a few stats. This is from Zero Fatalities. That's what that should say. I apologize for my typos, but just talking about motorcycle drivers. So 31% who were hit on a motorcycle were turning left. One thing I like you guys to think about is 40% of all fatal motorcycle crashes have involved no other vehicles. So definitely safety is key, slowing down. So crashes over 50 miles an hour. And the one thing I love about Zero Fatalities, if you ever want to see up-to-date statistics on fatalities and serious injuries, you can go ahead and look on the Zero Fatality site, and they have this great thing. So coming up, you can see in 2021, we had a big jump of serious injuries, not as many fatalities as in 2020, but we're already getting up there in 2022. So want to make sure that, again, this is one of the reasons why we do this injury prevention learning series, is to let people know what's out there and what to watch out for. And then to introduce our speaker. So Alejandro Moreno, I have worked with him for many years. We're not going to say how many years, right? So he's been a nurse with 10 years of experience in ED and trauma, clinical staff education, neurology, inpatient, skilled nursing facilities. He's received degrees from BYU, SLIC, and the U, and he's back studying for his DNP. We were just talking about that. In the cooler months, he enjoys skiing and complaining about the cold. In the warmer month, he enjoys hiking, swimming, traveling, and of course, riding his motorcycle. There were many times I saw Alejandro come into the ER carrying his helmet, all his gear, which made me happy to see him with his helmet all the time. He is married to Nina, a microbiologist and director at a world-renowned testing lab, and has 2 exceptional daughters who are aged 12 and 10. All right, Alejandro, I am going to turn the time over to you. Please remember I launched that poll. So I'm going to actually kind of end that, maybe if I can. And then we'll let Alejandro kind of see what we've got going on here today.
All right. Hello, everybody.
So if you guys can all, I'm going to tell you, Alejandro, I'm going to share this one more time. Or can you guys see the poll?
Oh, sorry. I think I just minimized it.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say, we've got mostly nurses on today, EMTs, paramedics. All of them are somewhat familiar. So we've got most of them that are somewhat familiar with the rules of the road for the motorcycles, a couple that are not familiar, and some that are very familiar. And then they've either never been on a motorcycle or dirt bike, or it's been a long time.
Perfect.
So this will be good.
So we kind of run the gamut. I'll kind of use this as like an open forum discussion. If you want to wait and hold your questions to the very end, that's perfectly fine. If you want to jump in while I'm saying something and we can kind of take off on a tangent, I'm perfectly happy with that too. I don't have a ton of slides, and this is more I'm kind of more gearing this towards like an open discussion type of thing. Let me go ahead and start this presentation. Where did it go? Oh, here we go. Start slideshow. Does that look good, Jamie?
Yep, looks good.
All right, perfect. So motorcycle safety. Kind of how Jamie was saying, we're still in a little bit of the winter's months. We're heading into full spring, where the weather starts turning nice, everything starts warming up for a minute. Everybody thinks, yeah, I'm gonna get back on my bike, and we kind of have these trauma seasons that sort of like go with the change in season here in emergency services, mainly that people who haven't ridden their motorcycle all winter long, finally that spring comes on, they're like, yeah, I'm just as good as I was, 6-8 months ago. I'm going to get right back on that bike. Or on the flip side, you get people that haven't been skiing for, 6 months. And as soon as that first snowfall hits, they come out and they get all their ski injuries and ruin their season. So this goes for motorcycle safety, and it can also kind of dovetail into your off-road, ATV, UTV kind of safeties as well. Is that give it a few minutes, especially if you haven't been on, if this is the first time in the season, take it slow, make sure your gear is up to good, make sure your maintenance is done, all that kind of stuff, just to make sure that you can enjoy the ride. So we'll go over some basic rules and regulations about motorcycle operation here, at least in the state of Utah. You do require a Class M endorsement, which means you have to have a standard driver license, an active, unencumbered driver license in order to operate a motorcycle. Funny enough, there's a couple other vehicles that are classified as motorcycles, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but some of them include things like the Can-Am Spyders, the Polaris Ripshots, I think they're Ripshots, or Polaris Slingshots, sorry. They're those like Batman looking cars that have the 2 wheels in the front and the 1 wheel in the back. they're considered to be motorcycles, which is why they can kind of skirt some of the safety features that they would normally need as like an automobile. And you'll kind of see that on the road from time to time. And there's a couple of other small individual manufacturers that'll make these three-wheeled vehicles that are still classified as motorcycles. My highest recommendation always, when it comes to anybody who's interested in any kind of power sports, motorsports, anything like that, is to take a rider safety course. I think I learned probably some of the best details of what makes me a successful rider thus far from these motorcycle safety courses. And I highly recommend. They're a couple $100. You can get them. I mean, they do them all over the place. Usually they're at the community colleges. You do, I think it's like 2 to 4 weekends. They have motorcycles there for you to use in case you're just not quite sure, you want to learn about it. And it's also worthwhile just to go in and get more information. They teach you a lot of the basics, a lot of the theory of riding, safe riding. Some of those things you can put into practice and also translate into your automobile driving as well. That can kind of make you a little bit more of a defensive driver. The other nice thing too is it counts as part of your practical, your practical exam when it comes to your motorcycle endorsement license portion. So on the very last day of class, the guy says he takes off his instructor hat, puts on his DMV hat, and says, hey, let's take this exam. And if you can do all the skills that they have you do, then you're checked off on that. You just go to the DMV, fill out your written test, and you're good to go. And if you do not pass it, then they do offer remediation. There's opportunities to get that all done, but that's one less thing to have to worry about. On a motorcycle, you have similar rules, if not almost identical to those of other motor vehicles on the road. I mean, you're still going to be held to the standards of lane changing appropriately, speeding, illegal stops, turns, U-turn, all the same things that you want to try to get away with in your car. Don't try to get away with it on your motorcycle, just because it can be potentially dangerous. Just because you don't have that giant cage around you, you're going to be a lot more exposed to potential for trauma and potential for injury if you do kind of skirt some of those rules of the road. Some of the things to be noting of also though is like road hazards. So potholes, debris, changes in the lane patterns, all those kinds of things you're going to be more hyper aware as you become more prone to use your motorcycle, just because you might be able to run over that 2x4 in your truck and it's fine, whatever. You just kind of like grumble about it, but you hit that on your bike and you might spill out and not have a good rest of your evening or afternoon. My favorite is lane splitting. It was finally legalized a couple years ago. It's my favorite thing. I grew up in Southern California and lane splitting is a thing. And then I came here to Utah in the late 90s and got tickets for lane splitting, and I couldn't understand why. And apparently, there's no law that says you have to wear helmets, but there is a law that said you couldn't go in between cars when they were stopped. And it drove me nuts for the longest time. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But lane splitting does have some caveats. It's not the same as in Southern California. You can't do it on the freeway. You have to do it in a zone that is zoned for that's 45 miles an hour or less. Your bike cannot be going more than, I believe it's 15 to 20 miles per hour, and it has to be under control. If traffic starts to move again, you're supposed to merge at the earliest convenience to back into traffic and vice versa. Those who sit in the long lanes of traffic and are very, very upset about me cutting through and getting to the front, I just want to give you the quick little consideration that I'm saving time, and that's great for me, but I'm also saving myself, and it's saving safety. Because when I'm sitting there by myself, I'm a sitting duck, and the chances of me getting rear-ended, or if somebody behind you gets rear-ended and then that pushes into me, I'm at much greater risk when I'm just sitting there in traffic, completely unmobile, unable to move. I actually have personal GoPro video of me almost getting rear-ended by somebody, and this is it predates the time when you could lane split. So as a personal protection, whenever I would come to stop in any kind of traffic, I would always kind of move right into that middle lane, kind of riding that line to give myself that buffer. And lo and behold, I have a video of a gal who came right up on about halfway up to where my seat was. So if I would have been in the normal place in the middle of that lane where I normally would as a car, she would have plowed right into the behind me, and it would have just totally knocked me off my bike, and who knows what would have happened. But the fact that I was already protecting myself, staying in the middle of the lanes, she pulled right in front, and I looked at her and I gave her a little piece of my mind, and then we went about our business. Enduro bikes are modified dirt bikes, which you can ride on the street, but they have to be street legal, which means they have conversion kits. You can buy them fully. The enduro just means that it's a bike that goes on road, off road. There are some bikes that are specific to this particular thing called adventure touring, and those are the ones you'll see. They're more upright. They've got a bunch of like the saddlebags, the cool things. They look kind of more technical. Those can go on road, off road, but they all have to have things like headlights, turn signals, brake lights, and horns. Those are all considered like part of the street legal package. And you can have just like a standard, dirt bike and add those components to it and make it street legal. That's fine. You just have to make sure that you have those. Some of the considerations too is what your tires are going to be like. So are you riding a sand bike that has big paddles? You can't wear it. You can't ride that on the street. Are you big fat nubbies because you ride in dirt or in like mud, and you're trying to take that onto the nice, clean, flat pavement? Consider what you're going to be using where and what would be the most appropriate. And obviously, like we said, consider the weather. Right now in full spring, it gets nice and warm. It got up to like 55 or 60 the other day, and I thought about taking out the bike, and then the next day, 2 feet of snow. You just got to consider the weather, because I've seen it happen a lot of times here at the hospital where someone rides their bike in, they're like, yeah, and then for the next 3 weeks it snows, and so I see their bike sitting there in the parking lot just waiting, waiting for that weather to clear for you to be able to make it back. And I like to consider myself an older guy now, that I like to ride for pleasure. I only ride on the days that I feel good, and I don't like to suffer. So there is gear and there is other stuff that you can use to ride in colder weather, to ride in rainy weather, in all kinds of different types of scenarios, and just be planning according to that. Make sure that you understand, if you're going to go on like a long backcountry trip, that you have all the equipment that you need. If you're going to ride on a nice sunny summer day, that you've got the appropriate equipment, and if it's going to rain, again, that you have the appropriate equipment. So some etiquette. This is where I was talking about the Can-Ams, right? We just make fun. We love everybody who rides on the road on anything, but some etiquette for drivers. So this is specifically to anybody who is an operator of any motor vehicle. If you're in a truck or a car or anything else like that, I always say, look twice, take a moment. There's no rush. There shouldn't be a rush, and allow the motorcycle that right of way. It may not necessarily always have the right of way legally by defined terms, but it's the same as like a pedestrian almost, right? Pedestrian starts to walk out, just give them the right of way, man. It's better than like running them over and saying, well, I technically had the right of way. You shouldn't have been in the middle of that road. It's like, yeah, I get that, but you also ran me over, man. Like, I'd appreciate you not doing that. Keeping your distance. That is one thing that really, really bothers me as a motorcycle rider, is people don't realize that the distance that we put in between each other is really imperative. It's really for my safety. And you'll get occasionally, if you're coming up too close on someone, you will get a very violent one of these that'll be a swat back at you, and take that to heart. It's not anything to be rude. It's just them realizing that you are way too close, and you need to just like take a step back, just relax, give them their spot. On a selfish note, motorcycle tires can kick up rocks and crack your windshield. They can scratch up your paint or dent your front fenders. So you don't want that. And also you don't want to put that motorcycle rider in any kind of danger where they could potentially be crushed if another accident happens. They are a lot smaller than you anticipate, and they go a lot faster than you anticipate. That is why one of the reasons why keeping your distance, looking twice, is really important, and allowing them that right of way, because you'll see them coming down the road. Let them pass. Give them that extra 5 seconds. Be that protector of that motorcycle rider for that moment, and say, you know what, I'm going to be your blocker. I'm going to be that person who's going to keep an eye on this left-hand turn. Like Jamie had said, how those left-hand turns are really, really scary. Be that guy who slows down. Be that guy who gives them the room to be able to make that dangerous transition. And then don't crowd the lane divider. That'll happen sometimes. We talked a little bit about people get very upset at the fact that I get to go ahead of them when I'm lane splitting. I have people that legitimately merge into, like, will pull closer to that right-hand side or to that left-hand side to block me off. And I'm looking at them like, what's your problem, man? Like, I'm literally not doing anything to take your time away. I'm not causing any additional time for you to get home. All I'm doing is trying to keep myself safe, and now you're making me unsafe. And I don't necessarily appreciate that. They'll get a kind of a start look at me if I'm not wearing my smoky visor. That being said, for riders, if you are out on the road, one of the things we like to do is tailgate sometimes. We know that we're fast. We know that we're nimble. We know that we can stop on a dime compared to our automobile counterparts. And sometimes we like to get a little too close for comfort. let's not do that. Keep your space, keep your time, keep your distance. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got from my motorcycle safety course that I took was assume that you're invisible. I mean, that is by far like the #1 rule I have kept to heart in my entire riding career. And I credit it to the fact that it's what keeps me safe and what's kept me alive and unencumbered, you know, knock on wood, up until this point, is just, I can have loud pipes, I can have flashy gear, I can have, you know, all kinds of things that are on my bike that cause attention to be grabbed to me. But at the end of the day, that's still not going to be enough. It's my responsibility to get out of the way, to stay safe, to keep my distance, to do all those sort of things, and assume that I'm invisible. I'm never giving anybody the benefit of the doubt that they see me when I'm on the road. I assume that no one sees me, and for that reason, I take all full precautions to make sure that I'm staying safe. Scanning saves lives. Scanning is literally that idea of always scanning the road, always looking for those potential hazards. We talked about potholes, we talked about debris, we talked about distracted drivers. You're going to start noticing if you ride a motorcycle, how many people are on their phones, how many people are eating something, how many people are just not paying attention to what's going on, and kind of merge into lanes and kind of merge in and out or aren't paying attention. One thing that I've been teaching my kids, because my oldest is now starting to get more interested in driving and driving theory, is I always talk about any sort of ingress or egress from the road is always going to be a potential for disaster, especially when it comes to riding a motorcycle. If I ride the freeway, I'm hyper vigilant every on ramp and off ramp. And when I'm going, you know, on the surface streets, every right turn, left turn, and intersection is always going to be a spot where someone's going to either try to push the envelope and make that red light. Someone's going to, on that freeway, going to be on the #1 lane and realize they got to go over 4 lanes of traffic because their exit's right over there. They're going to be like, well, there's not a car, and not see me and take me out. And anybody coming in are not going to be paying attention, or maybe try to merge at the last moment without recognizing that I'm right there in front of them. Being aware of what those potential hazards are is really it's going to save you. I've had a couple close calls where I started kind of getting in the zone. I was enjoying my ride a little too much. I got a little too zen and realized, oh shoot, that red light came up on me real fast. Or, oh, that guy pulled out in front of me a lot quicker than I expected, and I wasn't paying attention like I should have been. Technology is always a distraction, like we just mentioned about automobiles, you know, with their infotainment systems, and motorcycles are no different. They're, you know, I'd be a liar if I didn't tell you I didn't have an X mount on my bike that holds onto my phone so that I can look at my directions if I need to. If I'm going someplace, it keeps my, you know, my streaming music player. I've got a Bluetooth headset that's implanted into embedded in my helmet that has a microphone that I can take phone calls if I need to. I can listen to music or podcasts on my way to work. It's nice. It's helpful, but it's also distracting, right? Because if now suddenly I want to skip this song, I got to reach over here and try to find my right button that I can skip without turning it off. If someone's trying to call me, how do I answer? How do I hang up? You know, am I trying to check what my directions are because I missed a turn? All those things can be very distracting, and it's bad enough in an automobile, even worse in a motorcycle. My best suggestion always, if you're going to start messing with tech, pull over. There's always a spot to pull over, even if it's on the side of the freeway, even if you don't know where you are. Pull over, take a moment, pop it in neutral, turn off your bike, whatever you need to do, figure out your tech, figure out why your streaming platform isn't streaming anymore, figure out why your directions aren't uploading, and figure out how to text or call the person you need to call back or whatever. But just do it on the side of the road. Take those extra 5 minutes to make sure that you're safe, because there's nothing worse than thinking about trying to do this and then looking up and knowing that you have to do a whole lot of stuff with your clutch and your gas and your shifter and your brakes and everything else. Is just ridiculous. And then just as a fun one, always throw the wave. You know, we like anybody who's on 2 wheels, or depending on where you look, some people, they talk about it, it's like, it's supposed to be like a, hey, keeping your 2 wheels on the ground, staying safe, all those sort of things, except for the Can-Ams. We don't like them, but we're just kidding. Even if you see a Can-Am right on the road, you can still throw them the wave and be cool. And it makes you feel like you're part of that community, because there is, you know, a small subset of people in the United States overall, even in the world, that ride motorcycles. And it is, you know, kind of like a camaraderie that's built up. It's kind of fun. It's an activity. It's a method of transportation. It's a lifestyle, all those sort of things. And it's a fun club to be kind of a part of. And I've always got a kick out of it. So, you know, it makes you feel a little bit cool when you're out on the road, and throw that aside. Even the scooters, I'll even like, if you're on a motorcycle and you throw it to a scooter, you're gonna make their day. You're gonna make their day on a moped. All right, any questions thus far? All right, moving on. Endo, there's a little bit of terminology. So the guy on the left here, over here, he's doing what's called a stoppie or a front end stop. Those are super cool. You see a lot of trick bikers do them. You know, I've always wanted to be able to do one, but they are highly dangerous because obviously what you're doing is you're locking up your front brake and causing all of your weight to be shifted forward. So that requires a lot of balance in releasing this brake and holding it back and forth or whatever, so that your whole body can kind of balance in this shift and then sort of bloop, plop back. And it's super cool. If you ever watch YouTube videos and see stunt bikers, like when they do it, it looks pretty cool. I'm not gonna lie. And then sometimes you end up like this bro right here, who like endoed and fell over, like end over. They call it end over or over your handlebars. So this dude's looking rad. This dude turned out bad, but this guy's at an event, so he's probably more of a professional than not. And this is kind of what's going to lead us into what our case study is for a motorcycle accident that happened earlier this year. So our case study is about a 22-year-old male who's in a dirt biking accident. Go over some of the pertinence and kind of what may have led up to it. Also, some of the things we can kind of identify as potentials for what we could do to prevent these sort of things, and also to treat and deal with these sort of accidents if we come upon them, either on ourselves or with our friends while we're out. So this 23-year-old male, he was on a dirt bike off-road. He was in third gear, which many of you guys know about bikes. I mean, that means he's going pretty fast. At least, I would guess if he's already in third gear, he's probably going at least 40 miles an hour, is my guess. Unless if he's less than that, he's slowing down and it means he's starting to sputter out and he'd want to downshift. He was thrown from the bike over the handlebars. He was wearing a helmet, but I couldn't find per the EMS report if he was wearing other gear. Being that he was not listed as an experienced rider, my guess would probably be not, and especially the fact that he had a few beers earlier in the day means he was probably out funning with the boys or the girls or the family or the friends or whatever. It's probably one of the dudes hanging out. Somebody said, "Hey, you want to try the bike?" It's like, "Yeah, I used to ride back in my day." And maybe he rode when he was, you know, in his teens or whatever, had ridden once or twice, or kind of had an idea of how it would work, and threw on a helmet and went. At the very least, he wore a helmet, you know, and that's always my thing. The brain bucket's so important, saves so many people's bacon so often that I always tell people that if they're ever in a wreck, and this is my little aside, any people who come in who generally are geared up, who generally, you know, fare better because of the protective gear they have, I always recommend to write a love letter, right to all that gear company, you know, to whoever made your helmet, whoever made your shin pads, whoever made your jacket, whoever made your gloves. Send them a picture, write them a letter, just be like, "You saved my bacon. Thank you so much for this." And I've had situations where people got free gear back, where they use their testimonials, use their photos, whatever like that for marketing, and were compensated. Sometimes they weren't, you know, and that's fine too, but at least you're letting these companies know that what they're doing is helping out and it's making a difference. Oftentimes too, just again, as another aside, if you do have, you're supposed to have motorcycle insurance, and when you have insurance like I do for my bike, one of the things it covers, depending on your policy, is incidentals, upgrades, and gear. So for instance, if I were to ever wreck on my bike, my helmet's covered, my jacket's covered, my pants are covered, my boots are covered, my gloves are covered. Any incidentals I've done to my bike, the exhaust that I put on, the handlebars that I switched out, the mirrors that I upgraded, you know, any of those sort of things are things that I've done to enhance the experience of the motorcycle that are covered under the entirety of the thing. So some people get, you know, kind of upset about the fact that, oh, all this gear is so expensive, and we'll talk a little bit more about gear later on. But just know that it does have value in protection, and it also does have value in compensation. If you do have a wreck, you'll get that money back, you know, so it's worthwhile. The investment up front is worthwhile. So this isn't necessarily him, but this is probably what happened to him. That's a good what do you call it, example of what an endo looks like when you just go right over your handlebars. This is a pretty common occurrence, especially in motocross, being tossed this way. On street bikes, when you're riding out on the road, you have two different types. There's high side and low side when you get tossed from your bike. So high side is when you get literally tossed off the top of your motorcycle, and that usually happens as a result of a locked up back wheel. When you're braking too hard, your body will actually, and your motorcycle will actually skid off to the side. And when you release that brake, it catches grip again and will toss you completely off your motorcycle. It's called a high side. And then a low side is when you've lost traction and your motorcycle slips out from underneath you and you just kind of slide along with it. Less injuries are associated with low side wrecks than high side wrecks. but both are pretty dangerous. So you want to try to avoid, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. So blunt force with this individual that we did on this particular case study, he was tossed an approximate about 10 feet, and these are sustained injuries. He hit his head with mild scratches to the helmet visor, which is indicative of good wearing of his helmet. He had an obvious deformity to his left lower extremity, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and a mild right lung base contusion, or kind of a bruise. But he was asymptomatic, was found on incidental scan. He wasn't complaining of any shortness of breath, difficulty breathing. There wasn't any change in breath sounds when EMS was on scene. And so they didn't have any concern for like a disinflated lung or a punctured lung on that right side. It was just after they had scanned him a little bit, they noticed a little bit of that contusion or bruising in that area. So the left lower extremity, he actually had a femur fracture, and we'll talk about it real quick in the next slides. So femur is probably the most difficult bone in your body to fracture, and it is incredibly strong. It is incredibly versatile and resilient. And this is a young dude. I mean, this dude was, I think, what we said, 23 years old. So there's absolutely no reason why he should fracture his femur, and the amount of force that he put on that bone is significant. And so the fact that the only thing he broke was his femur is actually pretty remarkable given his circumstance. Given the nature of this injury, again, we talked about how fast I would assume he would have been going. The fact that he just had a femur fracture is pretty impressive. He got incredibly lucky. Pertinent negatives on scan, because they when they come in as a trauma, they get it all, right? There's no what do you call it? No expense spared, and no drop of radiation that's going to be spared when it comes to making sure that you are not broken in places that are really important. So big pertinent negatives, he did not have any spine injury or fractures, any skull fractures or any rib fractures, and he had no other extremity fractures. Another concern when it comes to falls like this is falling on the outstretched arm, which that in a lot of different types of high velocity injury, whether it be skiing and snowboarding, bicycle riding, skateboarding, and motorcycle riding, you know, your initial instinct is always to preserve self. So you're going to stick out your arms to kind of cushion your fall. Unfortunately, if you're riding 40 miles an hour and you stick your arms right out, that's great opportunity for those tiny little twigs to snap right in half. Tuck and roll is really the way to go. And who knows, maybe this guy was just so like flabbergasted when he got tossed from the bike that he didn't know any better, and he just landed right on his leg, and you know, and it just snapped right in half. So FAST was negative, meaning there was no sign of internal bleeding. FAST is our acronym for Focused Assessment with Sonography for Trauma. It's where one of our MDs will come in with a big old ultrasound machine and stick a probe right in your belly and push as hard as they possibly can, looking around for any sort of bleed. With being in that abdominal area, there's a lot of high value real estate that's in there, a lot of your solid organs that are very vascular, which means they take a lot of the blood straight off the heart and use it to do things like, you know, you know, filter out like in your kidneys, or you know, work in your spleen or in your liver, just these big organs that take up a lot of blood and push them through. That if any of those were to get torn or to get ripped or injured at all or punctured, they can really have a big opportunity to cause some serious injury, and without even necessarily being able to see it initially on scene. They also noticed that there was no signs of aortic tear or dissection, which again is also really good. Given the fact that he had such a blunt injury and that blunt force trauma, it's really impressive that he didn't have one of those things. You know, these vessels are pretty robust and pretty resilient, but they are subject to friction and forces like tear forces. Having an aortic dissection is a pretty bad thing. I mean, that's pretty much that's a life ender, basically. And everybody thinks of the aorta being right over where your heart is. That's where the ascending aorta starts. And then you've got the descending aorta. That's what basically fulfills the rest of your body's need for your blood. It runs right down the middle. Having those real bad abdominal pains, abdominal injuries can put you at high risk for a dissection or a tear in that aortic vessel. And like we said, in that retroperitoneal area, or that kind of behind your pelvis area, there's a big space. There's a lot of space where blood can start pouring in, and you just don't see it yet. You won't see that distension of your abdominal area. You won't see necessarily that tenderness right away sometimes. It all just kind of depends, but there's a lot of space in there for blood to kind of start pooling up before you even recognize that there is a significant bleed. So that's this guy. Here's some of his imaging where you can see over here on the left-hand side is his initial fracture. Right here, this is 29.6, almost 3 centimeters worth of loss in height. That where you can see this is his distal femur, this is his proximal femur, and that doesn't feel good. This sort of, Jamie, are you able to see the mouse as I'm pointing?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. So this little device over here is called a friction splint. So basically what they're trying to do is this part kind of grips on his under thigh, and they wrap around it at his ankle basically like a strap, and they pull them apart so that these bones aren't kind of like clickety clacking as much as they can. It only works so well out in the field, and there's only so much you can do, because what ends up happening is in this sort of injury, your muscles are on fire. They are freaking out, and they do not like the fact that this stability and all this pain is the pain is here and the stability is gone. So all of these muscles are just absolutely in like the worst state. They're hyperactive, they're freaking out, and they're just contracting, which increases your pain, because now you've got these jagged little bitties all touching each other, and like that's no good. Other considerations for nursing and hospital individuals are concerns for worsening, like a worsening vessel laceration. So if you have your femoral artery and femoral veins that run down this way, so these are nice new jagged pieces along with like a big significant traumatic mechanism that could potentially now have all these little serrated knives picking and pulling and whacking away at these really major vessels, which can either compartmentalize or cause like a compartment syndrome. If it bleeds enough into these spaces and it just has nowhere else to go, it can cause a reduction in blood flows distal to the injury. And then also it just increases your pain. It's so much. Being that this is a long bone, we're gonna have a lot of bone marrow in here, which increases our chance for a fat embolus to come out, being that little bits of fat can go over here. If there's holes in your vasculature, they can pop out, they can jump in there, and they can fly up elsewhere. They can land distal to your extremity, they can land in your heart, they can land in your lungs and cause issues with blockages there, heart attacks, strokes, pulmonary embolisms, all that kind of stuff from that fat embolus, because you've just got this giant long bone that has all of that marrow in the middle that has now been released by this gnarly experience. Over here on the middle is where you can see his internal fixation device. They basically, and you can see right over on this side is where they drilled the hole and hammered this entire thing. So this is his top femur, and this is the bottom half of his femur. You can see how they had to fixate it over here, fixate it here, fixate it a couple more down here by his knee. I mean, this is big, right? And even this little shard of bone that just kind of got left there, oh well. And this is kind of the spacing. Eventually, this will all kind of calcify over. I read through some of his progress notes, and it talked a little bit about how he did have a subsequent, what do you call this, acetabular fracture. So acetabulum is over that little cup over here in the pelvis, which is where your femur bone actually inserts and hangs onto. Luckily, it was non-operative. It was like some hairline fractures. They said it should be able to heal on their own, so it wasn't any concern necessarily compared to what was going on over here. But that, yeah, he basically had that full internal fixation device placed, had to go, or has had to go for rehab. We'll be having therapy. He's been non-weight bearing since I think February, the beginning of February when this happened. It's been total non-weight bearing, and they're now just barely working a month, at least a month in, to getting him back to weight bearing on that leg at all. This is, I mean, this right here on an elderly person, I mean, this could be a life ender, depending on how functional you are to begin with. In a younger person, maybe this is career ending. If you were an athlete, this could be just career altering. If you were some sort of physical laborer, this could cause a lot of problems, which is why we want to take extra special care. All right, so our initial concerns, anytime we come upon, whether it's motocross or on the street or anything else like that, bleeding. That's going to be our number one. We always want to know where that bleeding is, and it may not necessarily be what we want to, or what we'll be able to visualize. Kind of we talked about earlier, like that's why I like this meme, where the EMS providers look at that nasty road rash bloody leg, and you're like, bro, look at that, it's nasty. But you're totally missing the fact that they're becoming hypotensive and their belly is becoming distended, or they're starting to get pale, even though you don't necessarily see anything that is what do you call it, bleeding out or oozing out anywhere. You know, these distracting injuries are just that. That's why we call them distracting injuries, is because they're so gruesome, they're so cool, they're so gnarly that we kind of fail to realize that, hey, even though that's pretty mangled, like that's not his worst problem. That could potentially not be his worst problem. You know, we don't want to get, like we said, distracted by those. I've even had some, you know, secondary injuries. So we had a motorcycle rider last year who, you know, he laid down his bike, everything was fine, except he was wearing, I think, a 3/4 helmet or a half helmet, and he was wearing every other gear. But because of the way he slid out into some debris and ended up getting punctured in his eyeball by a stick. And so at the end of the day, like everything else was fine, but he ended up having this massive eyeball consult because he had a perfect, like a ruptured globe, because he got poked in the eye with a stick while he was riding a motorcycle. That was his big injury. So sometimes the distracting ones are the right ones, but it depends. You always want to make sure. But identifying that bleeding. Sometimes you'll have somebody with a punctured something and you'd be like, bro, that's where you're bleeding from. And other times you're not going to find that, and it's going to be a case where you're going to have to be very aware of what their vital signs, their cognition, their level of consciousness, all that sort of thing. That'll be indicators more acutely of a worsening bleed. Stabilize and ship. You're not really going to do much on the roadside, generally speaking. You want to get them out of there. That dude with the broken leg, my case study, he is not getting any help being out there in the dunes or wherever he was, the backcountry. He needs to get someplace and get stabilized, because he hopefully, I mean, more than likely he was otherwise fine just with that broken leg. Let's get it fixed. But if he had like destroyed any of his vessels, if he had had any concerns with worsening bleeding and stuff, that could have been a potentially life-threatening situation where it's most appropriate to get them out. Now, this is where it comes to, like, are you on the road? Are you in the wide open spaces, or are you with a car? Are you in a car where you found somebody like that? We want to be aware of not making injuries worse, right? If I'm by myself and there's a 250-pound guy who's got his legs all mangled, do I necessarily want to be dragging him up into the back of my Subaru and put him, you know, take him to the nearest hospital that's 400 miles away? Or am I better suited trying to make sure that he's stable, or make sure that he's awake, alert, conscious, and rest and activate, you know, some sort of emergency response, calling air rescue, ground rescue, something like that, figuring out what the next step is. When I teach Stop the Bleed, that's always my first go-to exercise. Is I'll ask everybody in the room, okay, I need somebody to call 911. And I sit there awkwardly and stare at people and wait for somebody to pull out their phone, and nobody does. And I was like, well, who called 911? They're like, well, we weren't sure if you really wanted me to, or what were you supposed to do? I'm like, exactly. Who called? Nobody. And you're 2 hours into this motorcycle wreck, or you're an hour into this motorcycle wreck, and you realize nobody's called for EMS. One of the big things I've always said, as being either as a citizen responder or as anybody with medical knowledge, is take that control and look at that first person you see, and you give them that finger point. You tell them, you call 911, you go do something else, you go do this other thing, and at least get the ball rolling. Because that way I know I have had that closed loop communication with rando individual right there that's now on the phone with EMS, with 911, saying, hey, there is a motorcycle accident. And they may or may not know a lot about it, but they can tell somebody, yeah, this guy he's down, he doesn't look good, we need somebody, and they'll dispatch a helicopter, dispatch an ambulance, something like that. So shear versus compression versus blunt. So these are the different types of traumas that you'll generally experience when you do have some sort of motorcycle wreck. The acceleration or deceleration of forces, those are really just kind of like basic physics, right? You're on a motorcycle and you're now accelerating in a certain, and I won't get into the physics because it's been a long time since I took physics, but you know, mass times speed equals, mass times acceleration equals force. I don't know. It's one of those, but basically you are going to hit every reaction has an equal but opposite reaction, right? So as hard as you hit the ground or the cement barrier or that truck in front of you, it's going to hit you back as hard, which is why we have things that help to decelerate those forces applied and disperse some of those forces applied. Some of the real fancy motorcycle jackets, and not even some of the, like even some of the other ones will have shock absorbing armor that's in them. I ride with armor that's it's called a molecular armor. So basically on impact, it hardens. And then as soon as the impact releases, it softens. So it doesn't like crush you, and it's not like you're hitting another rock hard thing, but it keeps you from the initial impact and disperses it immediately. I have it on my knees, I have it on my hips, I have it on my shoulders, elbows, and back. They also have inserts that you can put in for your chest as well, which I should probably buy. Also, your helmet is an incredible piece of protective equipment. You know, if you really break it apart, it's a bunch of styrofoam, which you look at it and be like, really, I'm paying like $200 to $700 for this piece of styrofoam, but it's highly engineered, developed, blah, 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 blah. And there's all different types, there's all different versions. I always suggest, going out there and talking to go to a motorcycle shop, or I always recommend the website revzilla.com. They have tons of reviews on tons of gear. They've got live people, and I'm not getting paid for that. So that's not, we don't have to worry about me getting compensated or what do you call it? I forget what it's called, but yeah, I'm not getting compensated for that one, but it's a great resource for which you can go, and they have live chat and stuff. You can ask them about gear and everything. But what it basically does is helps to disperse that energy. So when your head hits the ground, it's not your head hitting the ground and your skull is all that's going to absorb the energy and disperse it. You've got that protective casting around your head to help dissipate some of that. Now, does that prevent you from dying? Absolutely not. Like Jamie said in my initial bio, I've worked with motorcycle survivors of pretty bad wrecks, all the way from emergency, all the way down to the skilled nursing facility and everything in between. And I've seen some have really good recovery and some really not. Some with helmets, some without, and it all just kind of depends. I know that's a very personal decision for some, and I've had multiple motorcycle wrecks that when I ask them, are you gonna wear a helmet next time? Without even finishing the question, it's nope, I don't ride with a helmet. I'm like, well, that's not a good idea. And that's my humble opinion. And that's my advice to you is get yourself a helmet. And they're like, no, I don't ride with a helmet. All right, man. Then I will see you back here in my skilled nursing facility in a year when you wreck your motorcycle again. I don't. So your crush injuries versus pulling injuries, because you're going to be moving at a force, because you may or may not be tossed, you could easily get caught on something. You could get crushed underneath something. There's a whole bunch of different concerns that you would have on a crush injury versus a pull injury. Are you getting your arm caught underneath the wheel of a big rig and getting it ripped off? Or did you stop and something fell off of a truck and now it crushed your arm? Or did your motorcycle run over you and get crushed? Those are kind of some of the big concerns that we would have in these sort of more wild potential for motorcycle accidents, and how your energy is dispersed, right? The stop versus slide is really the way I look at it. And you'll notice too that when we pull up in another slide coming up, we'll talk a little bit about the differences in gear and the way the protection is for motocross versus street riding. When it comes to motocross, generally speaking, you are more dealing with the stop function. You're flying off of a jump, you're going a certain way, and you come to a stop fast because you endoed on your bike, you hit a rock, you fell off something, or you landed on a jump somewhere and you stop pretty swiftly, which is why a lot of their gear is going to be more on like the more like hardened type of protection. You're going to have more rigid knee pads, rigid boots, rigid gloves, rigid chest protectors, because the value in that is that it needs to be able to absorb more of that energy right off the bat and bend and break before anything else. Because that's also why you'll notice that most motocrossers will wear like a jersey and pants that are like jersey pants that don't offer a lot of slide protection necessarily, because they're going to be in dirt, they're going to be on, in mud or on sand or whatever. And the biggest concern for them is going to be falling on their motorcycle or falling off their motorcycle onto something like a rock or a log or something else like that. Whereas on a motorcycle that is ridden on the street, generally speaking, you will be at higher sustained speeds, and your chances of coming into that abrupt stop is going to be less, and you're going to want to more dress for the slide. That's going to be more abrasion resistance. That's going to be more like we're going to talk about road rash. We're going to be talking about kind of like that disbursement of energy over time, which is why most of your protection, like I was talking about my molecular armor, initially gives me a hard, rigid bump when I hit the road, and then will instantly turn soft again as I slide out on the rest of it. So here, there's another one, dress for the slide, not for the ride. I can't tell you how many individuals I've seen with this type of road rash coming in, and I'm like, dude, even a $50 jacket would have saved you so much time and energy and money on this rehab. It was worth it. You didn't want to wear it. It's too hot. Like these friends down here, we call them squids. That's like the term for the people that just barely wear the bare minimum of gear and ride around. Squids, they do what they do, and they end up looking like this when they wreck. And even the smallest wrecks, I've seen motorcycle wrecks at less than 15 miles an hour with a gentleman that ended up looking like this. And I've seen wrecks at over 50 miles an hour with individuals who are fully geared up, who had minimal abrasions and minimal things like sprained ankles and like, you know, bruising and stuff like that. So there is this, what do you call it? An acronym, ATGATT. Another one that I live and ride by, all the gear, all the time. It's 110 degrees outside. You will see me in my full face gear, my full face helmet, my gloves, my jacket with armor, my Kevlar lined abrasion resistant pants, my my boots and my gloves every single time. And it's hot under there, which is why I got vented gear. I've got little vents that you can open up and stuff, and you can increase your air vents or whatever. There's ways to get around it, but I 100% ride with all the gear all the time, knowing that this is what awaits me should I not. This is kind of, we were talking, this is more abrasion resistant, right? This is going to be your leathers. This is going to be things that slide along the ground. Whereas this in motocross is going to be much more of like that impact protection, where you're going to have that abrupt stop much more likely than those who are going to be riding on the street. I think that's all I got. Are there any questions that you guys have, or anything I can expand on, or anything else?
Everyone's so quiet today.
Yeah, I'm so quiet.
I just say the one thing that I like is that I read, I can't remember if it was last time we did this, but if you're riding with your kids, your nieces, your nephews, you know, younger kids, play the I Spy game for motorcycles.
Yes.
Because that will teach them at a young age to already be looking for motorcycles. Hey, how many motorcycles can you see on the way to wherever you're going?
And it gets annoying when they get real good at it. But also, like, it's planting those seeds.
Yeah, but it is, it's putting that in their head of like always looking, you know, at your and I think it just helps them to just pay attention to your surroundings, like you said, scanning all the time.
Yeah.
So Janet came on and said, can you talk a little bit more about like the lane splitting and the motorcycles that drive between cars?
Yes, absolutely. Obviously, there are some of us that like to stretch the limit to what is allowed. And I'd be a liar if I didn't say that sometimes I would ride when everybody else is going 5 miles an hour, then I'm just going to creep through. And it's a risk that I have to take. And taking that risk is also, it is dangerous, right? There is all danger associated with riding.
Mm-hmm.
And the more safety and the more precaution you can take overall is going to be really important. Some things to take into consideration, right? For instance, the bike that I ride is, it's called a sport naked, or it's kind of sport. Basically, it looks kind of like this, but it doesn't have any of these fairings, and it's missing a bunch of these pieces, whatever. It's like it's a more minimalistic bike, but it's really skinny compared to some of these wider, like Harley Davidsons or Yamahas or Victories that are going to be real big and substantial. So I have figured out like what the distancing I need between automobiles is in order to safely go. There are times where there are like two big, you know, dually F350s that are sitting there in the lanes. And I look at that, I'm like, there's absolutely no way for me to get through. And I'm not going to chance it. I'm not going to rush it. And I'll just sit here and wait. And that's fine. And there are other times when it's, you know, a ton of small cars and I can easily make my way through, and that's perfectly fine. But the biggest concern is making sure that if you are going to be taking that chance to lane split, that you're doing it appropriately, that you're taking into consideration the other drivers, that you're taking into consideration your own skill level and your risk assessment, because it is not without risk. You can potentially, if you're not paying attention, get hit by somebody's mirror. You can knock off somebody's mirror by accident. If they have one of those mirror extensions, say it's a bigger truck or a bigger car, they may have mirror extensions that go out. If the person's not paying attention and they see a lane start to open up, they may merge right into you, which if you're not paying attention, that is also potential for disaster. But it's also, I think, some of the reasons why in the legislature they had carved it out so that you could only do it on roads that were 45 miles an hour or less, and you can only do it while traffic is in the stopped position and not while they're continued going on. So in other states like California, you can, as long as you're clear and as long as you're within your own control, then the motorcycle rider is at their own discretion to go wherever and whenever they want at whatever speed is appropriate for them. Here it is a little bit different. I hope that answered. If you have any other questions.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that Janet was kind of asking about when, as a driver, when would we expect to pay more attention? So it sounds like it would be while we're at a stop. So not just like
Yeah.
stop and go traffic, not
Yes.
just like congestion, but at a stop,
At a
correct?
stop, yeah, at a stop is where it's legal to do.
Okay.
That being said, I've seen people drive over the speed limit. I've seen people run red lights. I've seen people make left-hand turns and U-turns where they're not supposed to. So sometimes I would say that especially as the summer months are coming up and as the warmer months are coming up, you're going to get some more of like, sometimes the squiddy individuals who may take advantage of some of this and may want to push a little farther and push the envelope just a little bit further. Just keeping an ear out, keeping an eye out, and knowing, just that idea of always kind of looking around, making sure that we're looking twice before we make our lane changes. And that also goes with the fact that when I'm riding, when I talked about that invisibility complex or that invisibility state that I'm always in, if I'm riding and I'm looking at a lane split, that's going to be my biggest thing. I mean, I joke, but like I hold my breath usually when I'm coming up on a thing, just so that I can get like as hyper focused. And I'm just like holding my breath, looking what's going on, keeping an eye on as I merge. And then I get up to the front of the whole line and then I put it in neutral and I take a breath. I'm like, okay, we made it, we're fine. And if I had to stop early, I can stop early. If I have to, if the traffic starts going, then great. And I didn't get to the front of the line, oh well, I got to get up front a little bit and I'll merge in and I'll get my spot later on.
All right, sounds good. I am going to launch this last poll, but feel free to keep asking questions, you guys.
Yeah, if anybody else has any questions, you can put them in the chat, or if anybody wants to chime in, I'm happy to do that as well.
I definitely have seen people, one of the people that I lost to a motorcycle crash, just freak accident, was wearing all the gear. Their rule was 32 degrees out. It was warm enough to ride a bike. All right, does anybody else have any questions for Alejandro? So I think your case study, it was lucky that it was a 23-year-old, could have been a lot worse.
Oh yeah, significantly worse.
As you get older. So, okay. Well,
so one more thing I was just going to add, kind of in that idea of safety and kind of like with the lane splitting and stuff like that. I'll talk a little bit real quick about being aggressively defensive. You may notice sometimes motorcyclists will like hit that run and they take off like in the very beginning or something like that. And before I used to ride significantly, you would see people who would like hit that gas and take off at intersections or stuff like that. You would kind of see them as people that were hot shots or trying to show off or whatever. And yeah, there are people that are going to pop their wheelies, there are people that do burnouts and all these kind of fun things, whatever. But for me personally, a lot of times when I will be a little bit more on the aggressive side to get out of a pattern of traffic, knowing that ahead of me is, a mile's worth of open space, whereas behind me is now 12 other cars. If I can make my way a little bit and cut through and get out, and now I'm out in the clear, that is that much more space that I've created for myself as a safety bubble, where I don't have to worry about people merging into me, rear-ending me, hitting me by accident or anything like that. And what can sometimes seem as aggressive driving, I used to refer to as aggressively defensive, where I'm just trying to get ahead of the pack so that I can chill out and be fine. And that might mean me coming off the line real fast. Like, I joke that like my motorcycle is about on par with a Ferrari for the 0 to 60 if I really pushed it to its max, which is super cool. And it's not a very big bike, but it's also the fact that it weighs like a tenth of what a Ferrari weighs. And so it needs a tenth of the power to be like on par. So sometimes, as long as you're comfortable, as long as you understand your skill set, as long as you understand what your capabilities are, that's really what's going to help keep you safe. Because when you start pushing your actions beyond what your abilities are, that's when you start getting into that danger zone. Like our case study with an individual who didn't ride very much, third gear in the middle of nowhere, wrecked his bike. If you aren't comfortable with riding on the freeway, don't ride on the freeway. Ride on the streets until you get more experience. There are classes you can take, like I talked about the motorcycle safety course, but they also have like at the some of the tracks, like the speed tracks and stuff, they have these things called track days where you can go and either learn how to be like more aggressive in like motorsports and actually doing motorcycle racing, but they also have clinics and things that they can do that will teach you how to be a more responsible or more like competent rider, the same way like any kind of like an accelerated driving course would, or like a ski lesson, or something like any type of other type of lesson like that. But it's very hands-on, and I've been meaning to take those, but I always kind of forget about them, and they're expensive. I'm not going to lie, they're cheap. They're not cheap. They're like $300, $400 or something like that for the day. But from everybody that I know that has taken them, they said they're well worth it. And if you're really invested in gaining more skill and understanding your motorcycle better and how to ride and how to like be able to like kind of unlock those features and do the things you really want to, then it's totally worthwhile to get that higher level of education and experience. But keep it within your skill set until you gain more experience.
Yeah, injury prevention is all about knowing your limitations, right?
Absolutely.
Fantastic.